The campus protests at universities across the country have mostly ended with the end of the semester, but they raised a lot of issues, at least in my mind. Why were the protests directed at universities instead of, say, at elected leaders or embassies? Did their strong support for Gazans veer into anti Semitism? Most of the country saw the protests through the lens of the media, and as we know, if it bleeds, it leads. So, were the YouTubes and images that filtered out of campuses representative at all? I could think of no one better to discuss these issues than with Eric Kirk. Eric is an attorney in Humboldt County and has advised some of the campus protesters at Cal Poly Humboldt. More importantly, he's a veteran of lefty protests and learned civil disobedience at his mother's knee. At the age of 4, he was already a veteran activist. He has participated in multiple protests for several causes since then, and he's always done so intentionally, whether it was spending nights in jail or candlelight vigils. He also thinks deeply about the causes he chooses to take on, and he's not afraid of nuance. He co hosts Redwood Wonk, a political commentary radio show on Access Humboldt, and All Things Reconsidered on KMUD. With that said, let's get on with my conversation with Eric Kirk. Welcome to the Odd Post podcast. I am your host, Anila Mirchandani. So I'm glad you could make it. So can you tell us a little bit about your background? First, with civil rights, you've been a protester, you've had a background in that field, and then as a lawyer, perhaps.
Sure. I mean, I was raised in a progressive family. My parents were involved in anti-war movement from my birth. They were actually some of the first people to organize protests against the Vietnam War in Noe Valley when I was 1 year old. And I remember attending anti-war protests when I was 4 years old in San Francisco. So I was kind of raised in that tradition. I started becoming politically active in high school and various issues. And obviously, when I went to college and then as an adult, it's always been an important part of my life. And I did participate in civil disobedience actions, either as a direct action participant or as a supporting person. And then later, when I became an attorney, I have since offered volunteer legal services to help people through it. And long history of it.
Yeah.
And more recently, I tried to help. I have been helping students and faculty at up here at Cal Poly State Humboldt County, and had a conversation with you, which led to you wanting to talk to me about it.
Yeah, it sounded very interesting. So when you were involved in civil disobedience, what were the issues, or kind of a range, or specifically some issues?
First time I ever got arrested was I think it was 1983, protesting the testing and development of the MX missiles, which we believed were being had first strike potential, which could have been used and destabilized the situation, the Cold War situation. Kind of showing my age, because they did eventually get deployed and, well, not used, but sent out, and now they've long since become obsolete and have been taken apart. But I protested at Vandenberg Air Force Base, and we entered the base and went to the silos, were arrested and cited and released. After that, I was involved in a protest outside the PG&E office in Santa Cruz as they were firing up the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant. Funny thing is I've never really had an absolute opposition to nuclear power. I actually have kind of what I would call a nuanced position on it, but I've always questioned putting a nuclear power plant on top of one of the most active earthquake faults on the planet.
Right.
And so I was protesting that, and I was arrested and spent 3 days in jail on that. And then subsequently, there was the invasion of the small island state of Grenada, which I was very
Hmm.
strongly opposed to. And on the 1 year anniversary of that, I was living in Washington State at the time, and Fort Lewis had was the training location for the Rangers, which is sort of an elite forces of the Army, and the training for for those soldiers used to be, I think they've changed since then, very dehumanizing and very scary. And we, a group of us, were protesting that particular training program, which has long since been shut down there and changed. And I was arrested and not even cited, just basically kicked off the base. But it was to draw attention to that training program. And those are the 3 times I was actually arrested in civil disobedience. I have acted as support for many others, including when
Uh-huh.
my mother and my uncle were arrested a few years later at Lawrence Livermore protesting some of the programs, nuclear weapons research programs at that location and
So
others.
you've had Yeah, you've clearly had a long history and you've seen a range of different kinds of civil disobedience protests. First, let's talk about your background as a lawyer and in what way you were helping protesters. Then we'll get to, the difference between the protests you've experienced and what students are doing today. If there's any difference, maybe there isn't, but we can examine that. But let's hear a little bit about what kind of legal profession, what kind of legal work that you do.
Well, I'm basically just a small town lawyer here in Humboldt County. I do
Mhm.
what comes into the office. I mean, and so I'm not but I have involved myself in civil liberties work, usually pro bono, but I've taken on false arrest cases of that nature, and I do a lot of pro bono work around political causes, sometimes election campaigns and the rest. And in the past, I've been called on to do help with nonviolence trainings ahead of time,
Mhm.
to advise students of or not just students but protesters of what their rights are and what they can expect. And basically, I don't tell protesters, but or when they're planning what they should do, I try to inform them of the potential consequences of their actions and what they should anticipate, and what they can do to avoid certain consequences. And I try to help them um, think about their choices in terms of weighing the effectiveness of what they're going to do with the potential consequences, and whether or not they want to consider certain alternatives to what they were doing. And we can get into the details of that. But I try to advise them of what has happened in the past, and there's a long history of protests and their effectiveness and their ineffectiveness, and it's been put together, and there's plenty of literature and resources out there to know and understand that. And unfortunately,
Mhm.
every once in a while, protests get started with new generations that haven't had the benefit of that. And I think that some of that has happened with some, not all, but some of the protests that have happened around the country, where they have a romantic view of protests that have happened in the past, but didn't really study up on how they could have made their protests both more affordable, safer, not affordable, more effective, safer,
Yeah.
and perhaps avoided some of the consequences that some of them are going to be facing.
So
And
now,
and
what? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Mhm. Well, and there are legal consequences, but of course, I'm more concerned about even the more serious consequences. I mean, as I was explaining to students, and we can like again get into that in more detail later, but you can recover from academic discipline, even an expulsion. You can recover from a criminal record, but you can't. It's a lot harder to recover from a serious head injury, and that's what scares me more than anything else,
Yeah.
right? And so, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I mean, there's one of the things that I like to point out is I was active in the 1980s as a student and a young activist, and I had the benefit of people who had been active in the 60s. And
Yeah.
some of them had been nonviolent activists, and some of them had been not so nonviolent activists. And a lot of them basically would come to we would plan out our actions. When I went to Vandenberg, and when I went to Fort Lewis, we had what were called nonviolence trainings. And some of the older activists and it would come and say, learn from our mistakes. Don't reinvent the wheel here. Learn from our mistakes. You'll probably make some of your own, but we've got some kind of institutional knowledge here that we'd like to share with you. And this is what we've come up with. And there are sort of protocols of nonviolence, and you may decide not to follow them. There are reasons to do this. And think about what your goals are. That what are you trying to achieve with this demonstration? Don't just think, oh, I need to go out and demonstrate, and you've accomplished your mission by demonstrating. Think about what you're trying to achieve, what you and then afterwards think about whether you succeeded in what you were trying to achieve. Think about, and you may have many different goals, but think about and what I'm doing or what I'm planning to do. Is that the best way to accomplish what I want to achieve? Am I trying to persuade people? Is the public with me on this issue? If not, do I need to persuade more people? And is my action going to persuade people? If the public is behind me, then am I trying to influence the events? Am I trying to change something directly? Then is my action going to actually have an effect on that? If I occupy
Yeah.
this building on campus, is that going to accomplish a ceasefire? I mean, no, and obviously not, but if in conjunction with occupations around the country, is that likely to do that or likely to result in divestment, which might be part of a picture that does it? But think about exactly what you intend to accomplish. Is my goal realistic? Um, and um,
Hmm.
and if not, but going back to is the public with me? A lot of times progressives, and not just progressives, anybody who is behind a cause tends to think that there's this invisible majority out there that is with them. And if they could just rally the cause, that everybody will be behind them. Tends to not be
Because they get
true.
into a bubble too. I mean, they only
Yes.
listen to each other, so they get into a bubble. So, one of the things that I hear you saying, and what I've known from older protests, is that
Mm-hmm.
people courted arrest. I mean, getting arrested was part of the plan because you were trying to draw attention, say, to an unjust law. And I will say, putting my cards on the table, I've never been in a protest, but I've
Mm-hmm.
learned about protests from the Indian point of view, the
Mm-hmm.
kinds of protests that Gandhi did. And he
Right.
would do, immense marches across the country to do like a simple symbolic act, which was not destructive. And it
Right.
would
To
be
make
the
salt
point
or
of it,
whatever. Yeah. Yeah.
make salt. And the point of it would be to court arrest and even to take beatings. So it
Yeah.
was very explicitly nonviolent. And it was also civil disobedience. You're breaking the law and you're doing it deliberately and consciously and facing the consequences. So, do you think some of that has been lost in today's generation? Some of
I,
that idea?
I think so. I think some of it has been lost, but I also think that you need to think, first of all, that I think also that there's a lot of young people, and I don't want to stereotype young people, but they want
Yeah,
things now. I mean, people are dying in Gaza, 35,000 by the latest count, and they want to stop it, right? I mean, they're frustrated. I mean, just day after day after day, the bombings are happening just like in the 60s. the Vietnamese, 2 million of them would die, 50,000 Americans would die, and it was frustrating. You want to stop it now. And people who tell you this is a long game, you got to be patient, that's frustrating, right? I mean, well, people
Yeah.
are dying. How can you say that, right? So it's frustrating. So you want to do something now. The problem is it doesn't work that way. You've got to have
Yeah.
you've got to think the long game. You've got to think in terms of this is part of a campaign. You're not going to stop it now. So you've got to think in terms of putting together a campaign. Usually it leads up to something like that. You start with just a march or a protest outside of somebody who can actually make a difference, a congressperson's office. If there's some corporation that's somehow involved in this outside their corporate offices or public place. You start with that kind of a thing. If you need to persuade people, you probably are going to reach a lot more people, especially here. You've been to Cal Poly Humboldt. It's kind of separated from all the rest of the campus. It's not like Columbia U or other campuses that are right down the middle of downtown. It's or Berkeley even. It's out, separated. So how many members of the public are going to get anything that's not filtered through the media, right? So, but if you're at it, so if you have a couple of students who are well informed, you got to first of all inform yourself of the issues. Got to be ready to talk about it, and then a table outside a grocery store that allow you to do it. How many people you're going to reach 50 to 100 people in a couple of hours, much more people than you reach all week in an occupation of a building, right? With much more detail.
Right.
So it's like, so you got to think in terms of a campaign of reaching people.
Yeah.
It's all part of it. So you start with that, and then when you feel like you've made some kind of inroads to the public, then you step it up, and you have it as a campaign. When people are familiar with it, other types of effective forms of making people aware that might raise awareness and attract media attention, the right kind of media attention. Street theater, letters to the editor. People don't take letters to the editor seriously enough. People do read those things, and people talk about those things. Op-ed pieces. But this takes work, right? And this takes knowing your stuff. And one of the more frustrating things to me was we have this organization up here called Access Humboldt. They go to public meetings, they facilitate. I've got a show on it. They wanted to set up, we had an Israeli exchange student who wanted to have a dialogue with some of the protests. They wanted to set up on a Zoom discussion between the two. The protesters said, "No way, I'm not talking to one of those people." So you've lost an opportunity there, and part of it is, I think, that they hadn't really informed themselves enough to have that discussion where they felt like maybe they wouldn't be able to stand up to it. So you've got to inform yourself of the issues so that when you're caught on YouTube and the rest, you're not looking kind of stupid. I'm sorry. And if you go onto YouTube, you'll find all kinds of incidents where these YouTube right wingers will go around, and probably the first four people they run into stand up to it, but they'll just find the fifth one that doesn't know what they're talking about, and that's the one that'll get posted, right? So you've got to have teach-ins to make sure that everybody is well informed and not propagandized, by the way. Informed. You've got to know what the other side's arguments are. You've got to have a full education of it. What is the history and what is the other side? And so it's just, and this is what the teach-ins in Vietnam did, by the way. This was a full-on education. These students that went there, they were informed. They could go up to somebody from the State Department at some type of gathering, and they could have a full-on debate with them. And they were ready for it. Many of these students aren't ready for that. You have to be ready for that. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, and what do you think so the fundamental these protests have been organized, so there's been a lot of thought put into the organization of it. It's been going on for months, but the idea that they came up with, and I agree with you here, there would have been many more, I think, effective venues for the protest, but the idea that they came up with was protesting their own universities using the means of encampments. That seems to have been a general plan all across the country. But again, like you say, I question the point of protesting the university. They have very little to do with the war in Gaza. And, in a very distant sort of way, which almost seems like a threadbare effort, that they have funds, they have investment funds, sometimes they're index funds that invest in companies that are connected to Israel. That's the best I could glean from it. But it seems like you're right. It would have been more effective to influence the public, perhaps in a grocery store, street theater. Those are all great ideas. So, what do you think about the fundamental idea of setting up encampments to influence the university
Well,
administrations?
I think what happened is some of the organizers read about the 1980s divestment against South African apartheid. And we did have
I see.
encampments. I actually participated in one, but that was later in the campaign. We didn't start with that. We showed up at the UC Regents meeting. We protested there. We made up leaflets. We had a whole campaign. We actually went to economics departments and actually had a whole plan. We approached the union to talk about how to divest the retirement plan. We had a whole plan put forth before we started doing that. It's when we weren't heard that we started doing that. It was part of a whole campaign. And by 1986, the UC system had actually divested from it. It
Interesting.
was part of a whole campaign. The problem here is the bombings are going on. Kids get impatient and they went straight to the encampments.
Uh-huh. And so let's talk about the encampments and let's talk about Humboldt, right?
Yeah.
They are at this point, I think they've been removed. I mean, partially because it's summer, but also there was SWAT teams sent in. So,
Yeah.
two things. Why do you think the administration felt it necessary to call in SWAT teams, which seems a little of an extreme reaction, but I don't know what was going on there. And how do you think the students were sort of conducting the encampment?
I'm not impressed with the administration here. I'm actually really disappointed in the reaction. First of all, the president, Tom Jackson, hasn't been on campus in weeks. He didn't understand what was happening, and he doesn't understand student protests. He says this is never going to happen again. Forget it. This is America. This is going to happen again. If you can't
Yeah,
handle the idea of student protests, you're in the wrong line of work. He was, deeply offended. Blah blah blah.
I
And
agree
then
with
he
that. Yeah.
then he said never again, which is really offensive because he's talking about it like he's comparing it to the Holocaust. And by the way, which drew a protest statement, or not a really a strong statement from local Jewish leaders saying there were anti-Semitic incidents, but the protest itself was not anti-Semitic. Yes, there needs to be education done, which, by the way, was your job as a university. I mean, it's just and so
Yeah.
there's been responsive stuff, but it was way overhanded. What happened was initially they took over a building called Siemens Hall, the students did, and the local police tried to get in, but it was they tried to get in one entryway and the students were able to block it and they couldn't get in. So then way overkill. They brought in police actually from your town, San Francisco, and from over the hill. They brought in, I mean, all kinds of people with drones. And I don't even know how many they brought in. But by the time it happened, we had faculty people who were and myself were like saying, please don't do the stupid. We need you. We're stronger with you than without you. We don't need you hurt or killed. And we talked to him, and this is symbolic. You cannot hold the building or this plaza or the building against a paramilitary force. And these are people without connection to the community. They will hurt you. And we had conversations about what you're trying to accomplish. They're probably going to do it in the middle of the night, which is what they did about 2:30 in the morning. And we convinced a lot of them. And there were, of course, a few hot-headed people, I think from off campus actually, who eventually left because we're not going to be part of this. And eventually one faculty person who remained on campus, a Pakistani individual, just a great guy, was convinced them not to try to hold a hall. It was only about 30 students left to go and do the nonviolence thing the way it's supposed to be done, a circle in the plaza. Of course, I think about 400 police. So it was again overkill, and the arrest happened quietly. Most of them, he actually convinced you've done what you could do. It's honorable to go home now or go back to your dorms, and it was quiet. The police were not advised. There is a code, I believe it's 409.7. I can get it, that allows the media to be there. The media are, even if they've closed it off to the public, the media were detained, not arrested, but detained and removed from the area. The police broke the law when they did that. Yeah, everybody should want the media there because it makes everybody behave better. And so they weren't informed. It wasn't clear which police agency was even in charge. But luckily, the students were well behaved, and so the arrests went quietly, and they
Mhm.
were removed. And to my knowledge, all of the students have been cited and released. No, I'm not even sure any prosecution decisions have been made. I don't know if you've seen, there was a water bottle when they tried to take the thing. So there's an arm hitting officers over the head with an empty plastic water bottle, and they're trying to investigate to see who that was for assault and battery. But obviously nobody was hurt from that. So that's the worst thing. There's graffiti. Administration is claiming $1.9 million in damages be due to the graffiti. I'd like to see an itemization of that list. I'd like to see bids taken to clear that up. I really question that. But there were no glass broken. This is not Columbia U. We didn't have the violence that's happened at UCLA because there was no violent counter protest. And there were a couple of pro-Meg type people coming in and trying to stir stuff up, but nothing major. So in the end, I think the students have learned something. I want to go in with some other people, including the local Jewish community, which is very progressive, leaders, and do some nonviolence trainings, and also talk about anti-Semitism and how you don't want to even appear to be anti-Semitic. And your intentions might not be. I had a very interesting conversation with a young woman who said, "Well, from the river to the sea doesn't exclude the two-state solution." And I never got back to her to ask her to elaborate on that. I think I know what she means, but
Mhm.
that's a discussion to it, because to some Jewish people who hear that slogan, to them that means genocide. That means ethnic cleansing of Jews between the river and the sea, which is of course the whole area from the Jordan River to the Red Sea. So that discussion needs to be had, right? And
I
and
mean, doesn't
and
that go back to your point about education? Because
right,
when students or when protesters pick up these slogans, they should be a little bit clued in to what the history of the
right,
slogan is. Because to be honest, a slogan can be made to mean anything in anyone's head. But that's
right,
not the point, is it? The point is, what is the context and the history that slogan is coming from, and what does it connote in the heads of
exactly,
people who are hearing it? And
right.
that slogan does not come from a peaceful, that's my
No,
impression. It
no,
doesn't
it's
come from a
it
peaceful
it,
place.
it
It comes
was
from, yeah,
it was Yasser Arafat. That's what he said he wanted to, and so it's just and when you're messaging, when you're protesting, you're sending out a message, and so you want to make sure that the message you're trying to convey is the one that's going to be received, and that's part of what you're doing. Now they're saying, well, yeah, but the people we're trying to represent who can't speak for themselves, it's their slogan, and so okay, well then you need to be real clear about this. But the more you try to explain, the more complex it is. So so
yeah,
this is why you've got to have a strategy about that, and a whole media strategy. You've got to have a media strategy. You've got to have somebody who could explain these things. And so rather than having signs up there saying that, you just have to have somebody who's explaining to the media what that means. I mean, and just be clarity, clarity, clarity. I mean, and that's
yeah,
uh the whole thing. But part of it too is the at least up here they all consider themselves anarchists. There's no leaders, and so that's fine. But then you got to really figure out how you're going to speak, and if you've got different groups speaking for themselves, you got to figure out how you're going to do this, as to how
yeah.
the message is going to get out, and it's difficult. But back in the 80s, the affinity groups, the affinity group itself, that's how we organized. What it was originally Grupos Afinidades, that's how the anarchists organized in the Spanish Civil War. It's where it comes from. Didn't work out very well for them,
Isn't
right?
that
And
a
anybody
contradiction? Isn't that a contradiction for anarchists to organize? I mean, to be honest, I feel like if you have a protest where people claim to be anarchists, it's all going to be chaos because that's kind of the
they
DNA of it.
they believe not. They believe that if you can organize from in an organic concept that we have the instincts as human beings to be able to do it. Obviously it's it's a very dubious theory from my point of view, but they believe sincerely that it can be done. Didn't seem to be very effective for him in the Spanish Civil War, by the way, for anybody who's read Homage to Catalonia. But it's
Uh-huh.
but anyway, but they do really believe that human nature, they kind of adopt a Rousseau view that that it was the imposition of authority and institutions of authority that take us away from what we are meant to be. And they really do believe that by
Mhm.
organizing along what they refer to as organic lines, that we can flourish in that way. It's kind of a religion, maybe, I don't know, but it's just, but they have managed to do it. It's kind of interesting because when they start to do their words, it's almost like a de facto kind of Robert's Rules of Order. They just call it different things, and I
Can
have
you
seen it
explain what
kind of
that
work.
is?
Robert's
The
Rules of
Roberts.
Order.
Yeah, can you
It's
explain
it,
it just
it's a
briefly what that is?
it's a set of rules for any meetings as to how they're conducted, but it's hierarchical. It's you've got somebody who's a chair, and you've got certain rules by which people can raise motions and how they're discussed. It's an orderly way of doing things, and then there's sort of the consensus that our anarchists set up, where there's no majority vote, but everybody comes to a consensus. But you don't have to reach a consensus. You just have to not oppose consensus. Ends up being the same thing, but instead of a chair, you have a facilitator. Instead of a parliamentarian, you have a vibes watcher. It's just and it ends up functioning the same way in terms of the dynamics. If you've got a good group of people, they're going to have consensus anyway. And if you have a bad group of people, even Robert's Rules of Order won't work. But it's
Are not
interesting that
going to
the
work.
anarchists refer to Robert's Rules of Order as robots' rules of order. It's a whole discussion that I don't have time to go into here, but it's
Yeah.
but it was always a tension, a source of tension in the 1980s when we were organizing across ideological grounds large events. You'd have your anarchists, and then you'd have your strict hierarchical kind of people who just wanted to get things done, and it led to long meetings and arguments, and that's the story of the
So
left.
the, so recently there was an article, and I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, that created a bit of a ruckus, which said these protests actually were not organic. And that's what I wanted to get to next, because that's what you said, there are anarchists, because they have been organized and they've been working on it for months. And I think one of the groups organizing these protests was Students for Justice in Palestine. And
Mhm.
what I want to ask you is, do you think that what you're talking about, which is like you're sensing a sort of lack of education and crossing the lines occasionally in slogans and so forth into anti-Semitism, do you think it comes from the top? Because I think a group that was more traditionally left-wing perhaps would have avoided the pitfalls of anti-Semitism that some of the protests got into. And I feel like this group didn't, because they themselves, often the group itself gets into anti-Semitic territory, in my
I,
opinion.
I could see Cal Poly. I don't think that organization was here,
Okay, I see.
and so it's a little bit different. I am aware that certain things happened at Columbia U,
Yeah.
and that there were I did see that there were incidents there, that didn't happen. We had a Seder happen. One of the local rabbis came up and did a Seder, and there were actually Muslim students who participated in it. So that
Oh,
doesn't
wow.
mean we didn't have anti-Semitic incidents up here. However, our local bagel shop got vandalized. And he opposes what's going on in Gaza, the owner, but he's Jewish and he has a bagel shop, so it was attacked, right? So it just so we did have some incidents here and some comments made by some students who probably didn't even realize that what they were saying was anti-Semitic. That's why we need education. I am aware of, though, of incidents at Columbia U where some gentlemen with yarmulkes were sitting in a library and they were harassed, where things have happened. Now, UCLA, it's a little more questionable because people were saying I was wearing a Star of David and I was harassed, but now later on, I'm hearing that they were kind of provocateurs, so I don't know exactly what was going on down there.
Yeah, in UCLA, it was a group of counter protesters that
Yeah.
came in, and they were pretty violent. And
Right.
I've heard they were definitely Jewish,
Yeah.
or like pro-Israel. I don't want to say they're Jewish. I have no idea, but they were
Yeah, we don't know,
pro-Israel.
right?
But I've
Yeah.
also heard, we don't know, but I've also heard they had links with some local gang. So I don't know what happened
Right,
there. I
and
don't think we fully know
people were
yet.
saying that they had links to the IDF, but that could be conspiracy theory. I mean,
Yeah.
but that group was definitely there. But also people going on YouTube saying I'm being blocked because I'm wearing Star of David. But then later I would hear people say, no, that guy had been harassing protesters before that type of stuff. But but again, there's stuff there. We also know that there was the gentleman at the Columbia U who was saying Zionists deserve to die, right? And all of that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, definitely have been definitely some issues there. And we know that, there is a lot of anger and hatred that needs to be dealt with. And if this organization has been promoting that, that is definitely a concern, and they're definitely not anarchists, right? So it's
No.
so that is definitely right. And so people who that's why there definitely needs to be education and warnings about what I would refer to as cadre type organizations. And you need to be aware of who's organizing what, and maybe you need to organize your own separate thing if you're not comfortable with who's organizing that.
Now,
And
if you were to advise a group, and maybe it'll come back in the fall, to have a protest against the violence in Gaza, but you were advising them to stay away from anti-Semitism and don't even, like you said, clarity, right? How would you tell them? Like, what slogans would you tell them to avoid? What banners would you tell them to avoid, and so forth?
I would tell them to avoid from the river to the sea. No matter
Yeah.
what your intentions are, it's just not going to. There's just too much. It's too loaded, for in its history. Even if you mean things well, I would avoid. I wouldn't even use the term Zionism because there's too much misunderstanding around that word. I would say focused on stopping the bombing in Gaza. I would, if somebody, there was a huge demonstration, anti-war demonstration in Tel Aviv a couple of weekends ago, and they were flying Israeli flags. If somebody wants to fly an Israeli flag, let them. Don't get it caught up in whether or not it's anti-Israel. If you feel like you want to see a single state, democratic state, fine, but that's not what you're arguing about right now. Right now, you just want them to stop bombing. Don't focus on
Keep your focus.
Keep the focus on that. And so you don't have to agree on everything. Unify on the one issue. You don't have to have agreement. So be open to people who support the state of Israel. Don't be exclusive of that right now. That you bring them in and you can have a discussion if you believe it's possible to have one big democratic state. I think personally, I think that's a bit idealistic right now. I think the best that can be achieved in the next 20, 30 years is the two-state solution. Maybe 100 years from now, you can talk about that, but 100 years from now, maybe we won't need nation states at all. Who knows, right? I mean, it's just,
who knows? It's too far away.
So
Yeah.
it's just, but it's, but, so don't don't be exclusive. Make sure that you're being Jewish positive in your statements. That you've got that. You've got Jews and Palestinians together, both flags together on your banners. That type of a thing. There's all kinds of YouTubes of like there's a YouTube out there of a Jewish popular singer and a one from Qatar where they each sing each other's national anthem. I mean, there's all kinds of things that can be done. There's a famous choir of mixed ones. I mean, that's what I think really needs to be promoted in this type of stuff. It's not radical enough for some people, but too bad. I mean, that's it's just what really needs to be promoted right now.
In fact, what you're saying, is really good key advice. In fact, for a lot of protests that sort of get too flabby, they take on one issue after another, and it loses people and it loses focus. And I think what your advice should be followed even in other protests is keep the focus very narrow, because that has the most chance of getting widespread support and the most chance of success.
Yeah, and I also think don't be afraid to condemn what Hamas did on October 7th. They're afraid that if they concede that they're somehow justifying the bombing. That was horrific, no matter what. I mean, that was just, that you don't have to agree that that's when it all started. You can agree that there was oppression and all kinds of things have happened for the past century. That led to it. You don't have to get into who started it. That's a pointless argument. You can say, yes, that was a horrible event, and I wish that hadn't happened. But right now, that's not happening. This is what's happening, and we want to stop this. Focus on that message, acknowledge that was horrible, and say, I wish that didn't happen, because if that hadn't happened, maybe this wouldn't be happening. But and we'll have to deal with the justice of that. But right now, kids are dying in Gaza, and we have to stop that. That's the priority right now, and that should be the focus of the message. And that's what the other stuff it needs to be set aside, and then focus on what you're doing. If they say, people who are pro-Israeli saying, but we have to defeat Hamas. You say you can't defeat Hamas without killing half the population of Gaza. It's just, you can't do that. You can't. It's just not possible.
Even working.
It's not working.
Not even working.
It's not. We don't.
They decimated one part of Gaza and they moved on, and Hamas has come back. So they're clearly not using a good military plan.
And half of Hamas is probably not even in Gaza right now. So it's just, it's like, you're going to say, well, why don't you start bombing Egypt then, or Syria, or, I mean, because that's probably where they are. I mean, it's just, so that needs to be focused. Those discussions need to happen, but you don't have to defend or even downplay October 7th. And to do that, because I've seen interviews where they go to a protester and they say, well, what about October 7th? They walk off in a huff, like they're disgusted that they're being asked about it. You just say, yeah, that was horrible. But that's not happening right now. This is what's happening, and it needs to stop. That's all they have to say. It's not that hard. It's just, but they feel like they're on the defensive, or if they admit that, it's somehow going to justify the bombing. It doesn't in any way. It's, you acknowledge that, it strengthens your position. It doesn't weaken it. And
that's a great point. Yeah, that's a great point, that there's like this defensive crouch people get into, that if they acknowledge that it was bad, then what is a protest about? Then they deserve the bombing, but they don't. And your point is really key, that by conceding that, they're actually in a stronger position. By conceding that October 7th was bad or horrible. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
I mean, it's just, and that's what needs to be discussed in the teach-ins and in the strategies for the protests. Acknowledge that was a horrific event, and that it should not be allowed to happen again. But but then argue the point that what Israel is doing isn't making that less likely to happen again. It's making it more likely to happen again. It's, every bomb is creating more enemies. So it's just,
So I have two more issues to talk about, and then I'll let you go. I know you have a busy morning.
sure.
One is free speech issues. Now, how do you think that these protests, do you think that they should have been permitted by all universities due to just, I mean, by free speech laws? Do you think encampments were permitted by free speech laws? What about things like graffiti or, blocking others from getting into the encampment? Tell me what you think about how it
I don't.
intersects with free speech.
They're not protected by free speech. Your free speech can't, first of all, can't affect the freedom of others. They don't have the right to block people from coming onto campus. And when you when they start demanding no discipline against the students, when you go in to do a civil disobedience action, understand what the potential consequences are and be ready to accept them. That is something that was always there. If you are going to break a law or break a rule, then be ready to accept those consequences. If you're going to commit
That's what civil disobedience means.
That's what it is. If you're going to commit a misdemeanor, then in California, that's facing the potential of up to 6 months in prison or $1,000 fine. Be ready, plan your life around that. If you can't afford to do that, then don't do it. If you're going to commit a felony, expect that it could be worse than that. So be ready for those consequences and don't be shocked if it happens. It probably won't be. You probably won't get 6 months in jail for an act of civil disobedience, but assume the worst. And if you're going to break rules of the school, assume that you could be expelled. It may not happen. It probably won't happen, but just assume that and be ready for that. It's free speech, to a certain degree. They can't stop you from doing some, but an encampment is not. A march is, and certainly holding up signs is, and all of that. And they can't control the content of your speech in any way, but they can control time, place, and manner. That is that is within reason, and as long as it doesn't affect they can't put you off in a corner where nobody can see you. But that's and so that that is so it's not free speech, and it's certainly not free speech for you to physically interfere with where somebody else can travel. That is absolutely not free speech ever. And it's not free speech to deny somebody else free speech in any way, shape, or form. So people get confused about what their rights are, and that's another reason to have these trainings. Do not interfere with the media in any way. One of the things that was drilled into our head by the 60s activists: if there's violence, you're going to be blamed no matter what. The media will blame you, even if the police initiate it, because they're probably not going to see that. All they're going to know is that the violence happens. They see the commotion. They're going to go and they're going to see the altercation, and the police are going to say you started it, and they're going to believe them, right? I mean, maybe not. Maybe some media will dig deeper, but just assume they're going to blame you, and don't make yourself the issue. Columbia University has had a history of this. Mark Rood led an occupation of the admin building, and what was the story? Not that they were protesting the war in Vietnam, but that the students, when they took over the chancellor's building, got into his brandy and symbol. That's what we remember now, 50 years later. Not what they were protesting. Not the fact that a lot of them got beaten up badly when the police retook the building. We remember that they got into the chancellor's brandy and cigarettes, and how dare they, right? I mean, it's just brandy and cigars. That is the symbol, the brandy and cigars occupation. So don't make yourself stay disciplined. There's an excellent movie that came out a couple of years ago called Selma, about Martin Luther King and how they did the Selma.
I didn't see it.
Well, there's a scene in there where they're doing a civil disobedience operation, and there's a small group of people the police are brutalizing right then and there. King and the rest of them just have to stay still as a matter of discipline. Students here are yelling at police, calling them pigs, saying, "You can't do that." you've got to have the discipline to not say anything or do anything that will endanger the whole crowd. What you say and do when you're doing civil disobedience, it's not just about you, it's about the safety of everyone there. And if the police are doing something wrong, you can chant, you can sing, you try to de-escalate, but don't start screaming at them. You can't do that. We blah blah blah. You have to have the discipline to hold back. That scene is an excellent example, and you can see King is just in pain when he's doing it in that scene. I mean, it's something that should be shown at all of them. If you can't handle that discipline, then don't do it. You're not cut out for it. You've got to be able to hold back and just hold your focus. You can fight it out in court or another scenario later, but you can't do it there because they've got guns and clubs and everything. And if you act out, even if you say something to escalate it, you're putting everyone else in danger with it. And you've got to understand that. I mean, these are things that are done through training. I think that scene is excellent for the trainings. And people are going to look at that and say, you can't do that. They all should have gotten involved. They all should have turned it into a riot, and it's like,
it
no.
turned into a brawl. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, no, that would have then, they would have blamed it on King, and he would have lost all of it. And they would have, the media would have reported it as a riot, a typical black riot. And that's how it would have ended. And it would have done that group no good. It wouldn't have done anybody any good. Instead, they kept the moral high ground, and that they were able to then help that group later, and the rest.
In fact, going back to Gandhi, because that's what I'm more familiar with, there was a time when the civil disobedience protests that he had originated and was the leader of went out of hand, and a police station was burned, and there was some other acts of violence, and he literally went on a hunger strike until all the violence came to an end, and it did. So I think that those messages, those lessons really need to be refreshed in people's minds. I agree with you. The other thing is, how effective do you think the protests were? We talked about what their strategies were, and you pointed out a lot of flaws. At the end of it, how effective do you think it was? It seems like it's pretty much over. Maybe they'll start up again in the fall. Or do you think they were effective, or do you think they ended up drawing more attention to the protests themselves rather than to Gaza?
I mean, it's hard to measure. It does. On the one hand, it does create the sense that there is a sense of outrage as to what's happening. Biden says it's having no effect, and it probably is having no effect on his policy. His approval ratings have dropped, and his polls have dropped somewhat, because I think he is losing some of the youth vote on this, because he's not taking stronger measures against Netanyahu, and they feel like he should. Whether or not he could, I don't know. What's politically feasible. So to a certain degree, it is creating the sense that there is a feeling of outrage against what is happening in the Middle East. I think to that degree it is. I think it may have, but in terms of viewing their particular movement, I think in general most Americans probably have a negative view of the protesters. So while it may have had some little bit of an effect, I don't think it has any better effect if they had all organized marches into the cities of which they were. They had all had simultaneous marches day after day, weekend after weekend, that weren't occupations, that probably would have had the same effect. So I think that they were effective, but I think they could have done other things that were less destructive that could have been just as effective, if not more effective.
Okay.
I think the nation needed to know that the students were all opposed to this. I think they could have conveyed that message in just as effective way without the consequences that they're facing.
But is that even the case? Because some of the polls we've seen, for example, I saw a poll that said that around 8% of student body was involved in the protests, and even the opinions aren't really universally matching what the protests were. What do you think about that? How was it at Humboldt?
but how many people are paying attention to those polls? I think the impression that they're giving is these
Yeah.
campuses are there. I mean, you see these idiot conservative judges saying they're not going to hire interns from Columbia AU, which is, by the way, extremely unethical to even say, let alone do. Um, and
Yeah.
um, and you've got people all over saying, "Oh, colleges are useless. They're teaching people." So the impression out there is that they are speaking for all college students, whether or not that's accurate.
True.
I think the same was true in Vietnam. Most students didn't protest, but enough of them did that it gave the impression that this was the year. And I think that actually, even though most people in Vietnam didn't protest, most students did. I think most of them were not for the war. And I think probably most students are probably opposed to it, but weren't going to participate in encampments. Probably a lot more of them would have participated in marches, and they would have been a lot bigger. But we're not going to participate in this kind of stuff. I mean, that's the thing, is that you stick to stuff that is nonviolent and is not going to jeopardize their academic careers or land them in jail or get them hurt or get them looking stupid. They you probably would have had a lot more participants, and that's something you need to think about, is to get more people protesting. I mean, there were a lot of people in the 60s, and even today, they used to protest in suits, used to dress up, not and you wanted to look like an average person when you protested. You wanted people to take you seriously. And there's something to that. I don't want to have a dress code. That's stupid. But I think that there is a way you want to do certain things. Sometimes not even have chants and slogans. One of the things that attracted me back when I was kind of exploring religion in my 20s was that attracted me to the religious left is they had candlelight vigils and sang songs. I thought that was so much more effective, at least to me, than chanting slogans and everything. I mean, they were, so there's just different ways of going about things that I think are just so much more effective. You don't have to have quite frankly, that I question the approach of these encampments and the clashes with police and other students is kind of testosterone laden, is in my opinion. It's
Yeah.
there's a whole way of doing this that I think that it's that we got to look at a different way of looking at it. That it's not appealing. One of the things that when as I was an adult, I kind of went through a phase where I considered more conservative ideas, and I actually do respect conservative worldviews and ideas. But one of the ways I sort of rejected a lot of the conservative worldview is it tends to appear to our fears and our prejudices more the progressive views. Part of the reason progressivism has such a hard time in this world is it's trying to appeal to our frontal lobe, kind of things, our reason, and that's not, and that is
Rather
a
than
hard.
our lizard brain.
Right, exactly. And so I think our methods should match what we're trying to do here, is that we want to appeal to these. And I think we should really try to embrace critical thinking. And but there's so many people say, "Oh, critical thinking, that's Western, philosophy and blah blah blah," and they want to reject that. That's I'm sort of again, reductionism is a real problem with the extremes of any ideology, and this is what I run into in terms of this. And so this is what I'm trying to get people. You got to think about what you're doing, think about it ahead of time. Think about it while you're doing it, and think about it afterwards. Really just try to be present in your mind, what you're doing each step of the way. Think about how you're coming across. And this is true of all aspects of life. Be present in it. It's where you get in trouble is when you're not present in your thinking and your body and everything. I'm not a big, Eastern philosopher or anything like that, or I don't do this stuff, but it's basic kind of common sense. Just think about what you're doing, be aware of what's going on around you, be aware of the people there, and think about their reactions to what you're doing. Don't make them afraid of you. You're not going to get through to anybody if you make them afraid of you. If you're trying to make them afraid of you because you're trying to get a certain immediate result, that's fine. But then you got to be where they are. The people that you're trying to influence aren't on your college campus, for crying out loud. Go to the Pentagon then, or wherever you think that the decision makers are being made. Scare them and see where it gets you. Maybe it'll have some kind of effect.
In jail.
Exactly, right. I mean, but scaring your fellows.
This is the reason that Gandhi chose this means of protest. I mean, he was very, as you're saying, he was very conscious and deliberate about it. He knew that he could never defeat Great Britain with arms and violence. So he said, we're going to eschew that and defeat them on the moral arena. And he succeeded to a large extent. There were people in Parliament who were on the side of Gandhi in the British Parliament. Point taken on that.
To be fair, what I used to argue, because I've never really been a pacifist, but what I used to argue when I was talking to pacifists who embraced Gandhi and Martin Luther King is that, and I think there's a certain truth to it, but I also think it's overblown, is that Gandhi and Martin Luther King could say, was kind of saying to the ruling class, or whatever you want to call it, hey, you can either deal with me or look at those Black Panthers and Muslim nationalists over there. Or Gandhi could say, hey, look at those violent nationalists over there. You can either deal with me or deal with them. So they kind of benefited from the violence in a way. That doesn't necessarily just take from what they say, but that's what some of the people would say, is that it's only effective because of the alternative. But then that's kind of a yin yang thing, right? It's kind of
it also goes back to what you said. It was strategic. They weren't just doing things in a sort of unthinking way. They did it in a very strategic, very pointed way. And yes, you're right. If they leaned on showing the more violent side to frame themselves as the middle ground, sure, it was a strategic choice, but it was a smart choice.
But I miss Eric, the day we don't have as many pacifists as we used to, and I miss them. I found them frustrating back in the day. I miss them. I wish we had more of them in the movements now. I really miss them.
Yeah,
I want them to come back. But
so Eric, what would you, if there's an aspiring civil disobeyer, what would you have them read? What would you have them study? Maybe movies to watch? How would you, if they're setting up on a goal of self-study, what would you tell them to read?
I mean, I haven't read them since college, the works of Gandhi. I do suggest there are several books by King. Selma, I think, is a really good watch anyway. Also had good because it dealt with the tensions between the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was King's organization, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was the younger, slightly more militant group, and the tensions between them. They ended up working very well together to get the Voting Rights Act passed. That movie is actually pretty accurate on a number of things about that. I strongly recommend that movie. And it again has that scene in there, which I think should just be shown in these things. If you go online, I believe that even though there isn't that much activism around anymore, I believe you can find a PDF copy of the Livermore Action Nonviolent Handbook, I think it's called, or something substantial to that. That is still available on it, and it's got it. I think it's available on something called the Commons. It's activist.
I'll look it up. I'll put it up. I'll put it on show notes. I'll dig it up and put it in.
Do that. I mean, and then I mean, there's a wealth out there. If you Google nonviolence trainings, nonviolence principles, Martin Luther King's, and maybe he took them straight from Gandhi, I don't know, 6 principles of nonviolence. You may not agree with them, but read them and be aware of them. Just so that you're aware of the philosophy, that it's out there. Like I said, I don't necessarily adopt it as a life philosophy, but I respect it, and I wish more people would. I want more people out there to adopt it, because I really would feel more secure if there were more people out there who did it. I'm not a religious person, so I'm not sure I believe that the universe believes in justice. I want to believe that. I would love to
Doesn't.
believe that. You know,
Yeah, I don't think it
but
does. Yeah.
I don't think it does either, or there wouldn't be cancer, right? You know, I mean, but it's just or other things like that. On the other hand, I don't know. The universe came up with garlic and things like that, so it's just very very good things, and avocados and but it's anyway. I just I think it's there's some great readings out there. The history needs to be recreated or not recreated, relearned. I also strongly suggest that people, specifically on the Middle East, learn all sides of the fight. This is something, and I do call it a fight. This is something that goes back 150 years. This didn't begin in on October 7. It didn't even begin in 1948. It goes back beyond that.
Yeah.
One book I would recommend from the Israeli side is Israel, a history by Sir Gilbert. I'm forgetting his first name, but we can look that up. And
We
then,
look it up.
yeah, and then I'm forgetting the author's name, but the War on Palestine, 100 years. I'm forgetting the title of that too, but that's from the Palestinian perspective. Two books to read. In tangent, I've got criticisms of both of them. Unfortunately, there's no real neutral book out there, but both of them will do that. One of the things I like about Gilbert's book is that he does acknowledge some of the violence from the Jewish side, tries to explain away his frustration and the rest. I mean, we talk about the complexity of the Grand Mufti making an alliance with Hitler, right? In Jerusalem. But the Irgun, which was an extreme Jewish terrorist group who was killing British as well as Arabs throughout the late 30s and early 40s, tried to make an alliance with Mussolini after Kristallnacht, right? After this was happening. And no, okay, Mussolini wasn't killing all that many Jews, but he was allied with somebody who would kill 6 million of them, right? So Erdogan might have saw this as that, and the Erdogan was a base terrorist organization. And they ended up being taken right into the IDF in 1948. So it's a very murky, messy picture here. Nobody can throw stones in this. This is a really messy, violent history all the way around. Everybody needs to learn it. And there were 600,000 Jews in the area, refugees from where the 6 million of them had just been killed. And you'd had this promise made to them after the war that they were going to get all of Mandate Palestine, which included what is now Jordan. That got cut in half. There were negotiations and talks going on. It's not as clear cut as everyone wants to believe on both sides. It was a
Yeah, in
really
fact, that
messy
might
thing.
be the theme, I think, of maybe this podcast is that people shouldn't be looking for simple solutions because there
No,
aren't any. I think
no,
that was maybe the major flaw of, in my opinion, like with a lot of the protesters, which was they were their heads were in a simplistic
yeah,
solution space, but it would have been avoided if they had listened to what your advice has been, which is keep the focus narrow.
yeah,
Don't try to solve the problems of the world,
no,
certainly not
no,
of the region. Just keep the focus narrow, stop the bombing in Gaza, and keep,
yeah.
whatever the focus was to
Yeah,
be. Yeah.
I mean, and the point is there needs to be discussions because while I agree, while I question whether Israel should have been formed where it was, I mean, if anything, maybe carve out a part of Germany for them, right? But it just, it was like, but to say it was a colonizing thing, that is a complete misunderstanding of what happened. That's not what happened, and it's just it was much more complicated than that. It has nothing to do with Europe coming to the United States. There's no basis for comparison to that. And people need to read and understand the history, need to read it from different perspectives, because it is one of the most complex situations there that are happening there. People need to understand that people didn't identify as Palestinians really till the 60s. Before that, they were Arabs. The original part was they wanted to be part of Egypt or part of Syria. They didn't want a nation of Palestine in 1948. I mean, and these are important for different reasons. They need to understand the complexity of the history and to be able to discuss it. And it's hard to do that in the format of the way they've decided to protest. But if you stick to stop bombing children in Gaza, that's easy. That's not complicated. That is simple.
Yeah.
Focus on that. You don't have to get to the other issues. Stop bombing civilians. That's you're not defeating Hamas. Stop bombing civilians. It's just that's.
In fact, that's something I think both pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian people can agree on, because it's not even working to gain Israel's aims.
It's not making Israel safer. It's making Israelis less safe. Right. So it's so that's so focus on the message, the clear message, and then try to educate about it so that for the longer solutions you can be part of an intelligent discussion about it, because that's going to be really complicated.
Yeah, I think we leave it at that.
Okay.
Thank you, Eric. It's been great. And I really thank you for talking to me.
Thank you, Anila. I really appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.
This has been hosted and produced by me, Anila Mirchandani. If you enjoyed it, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.